The whisper started long before the palace doors quietly closed behind Catherine, Princess of Wales, that morning, but no one outside those walls knew that within minutes a doctor's sentence would rip through royal composure like a lightning strike, leaving both Catherine and Prince William staring. At a reality they were never meant to confront in public, because the truth about Prince Louis of Wales had been building quietly, secretly, and perhaps deliberately hidden until it could no longer stay buried. The room was calm at first, almost unnervingly calm, the kind of controlled silence that royal institutions have perfected over centuries, a silence designed to soften the edges of bad news before it is delivered. But Catherine immediately sensed something different in the air, something heavy, pressing against the walls, because routine checkups do not require this level of tension, and they certainly do not bring multiple specialists into the same room exchanging careful looks before anyone speaks. The words that finally emerged from the physician's lips did not arrive gently. They fell with a weight that shattered the calm instantly, and according to insiders, Catherine's face changed before the explanation was even finished, as if a mother's instinct had already reached the conclusion. Her mind was still trying to process. Moments earlier, she had walked in with confidence, expecting another routine report about developmental monitoring, the kind royal children undergo constantly under the microscope of public life. But the language the doctors used told a very different story. Their tone carried the kind of finality that does not belong in a simple checkup. It sounded rehearsed, calculated, as though the conclusion had existed long before Catherine was invited into that room. And that realization, more than the diagnosis itself, was what caused everything to unravel. According to accounts that later leaked from palace staff, Catherine's composure collapsed in a way rarely seen within royal walls, the chair scraping loudly across the polished floor as she stood abruptly, her voice breaking with questions that no one in the room seemed prepared to answer. Why had this not been mentioned sooner? Who already knew? And how long had these concerns been circulating quietly through palace channels while she was reassured that everything was normal? The silence that followed those questions spoke louder than any explanation. Within minutes, the palace machine activated with the precision of an emergency protocol. Phones were muted. Internal communication lines abruptly halted mid-conversation. Aides moved quickly through corridors, delivering quiet orders that were never written down. Staff members were instructed in clear terms: do not speak, do not speculate, and do not repeat what happened inside that room. The system that protects the monarchy from scandal had shifted instantly into containment mode. Witnesses later described seeing Catherine escorted through private corridors rarely used even by senior royals, her expression pale, eyes swollen with shock, while William remained behind, speaking in hushed tones with the medical team, his posture stiff with the impossible burden of balancing two identities at once: a father hearing frightening news about his child, and a future king trained to absorb crisis without allowing it to show. Yet the deeper mystery was not only the diagnosis, it was the timeline, because as Catherine's mind raced through memories of the past year, small details suddenly began rearranging themselves into something far more disturbing. The subtle pauses in Louis' speech, moments during public events when he seemed strangely withdrawn, the brief flashes of imbalance during play that had been dismissed as childish clumsiness. At the time, they had looked harmless, even charming, but now every single moment returned with a new and terrifying meaning. Prince Louis of Wales had always been known as the playful spark of the royal family, the child whose mischievous smiles often stole the spotlight during ceremonies, yet palace insiders now admit there had been quiet observations for months, observations that never quite reached Catherine in their full seriousness. A nanny reportedly noticed subtle difficulties with coordination. A tutor mentioned that Louis occasionally struggled to follow instructions during overstimulating situations. Even video clips from public appearances had shown the young prince appearing unusually fatigued or distant at times, moments the public dismissed as normal childhood distraction, but which palace staff quietly logged in private reports. Looking back, those tiny details no longer felt random, they felt like clues, and that realization haunted Catherine almost immediately after leaving the medical wing. Because if those clues had existed for months, then the obvious question became unavoidable: why had the investigation into them moved so slowly? Who had decided that further testing could wait? The palace calendar, packed with appearances and carefully choreographed family images, had rolled forward relentlessly, while behind the scenes the concerns about Louis were apparently circulating in whispers rather than urgent action. For Catherine, the possibility that time had been lost because of optics, because someone worried about appearances, was almost unbearable. And as she began demanding second opinions and independent consultations outside the palace system, she discovered something even more troubling. Every request encountered resistance. Advisors urged patience. Doctors said more observation was needed. waited. Palace officials emphasized discretion and procedure. Each answer sounded reasonable on the surface, yet together they formed a wall that seemed designed not to help her find answers, but to slow her down. And that was when the quiet conflict inside the monarchy truly began. Because Catherine was no longer simply asking about medical details, she was challenging an institution that protects its image with ruthless discipline. Even conversations with King Charles III reportedly carried a tone of cautious distance, focused more on stability and legacy than on the emotional chaos consuming the young family. Meanwhile, the quiet influence of Camilla was whispered about by insiders who believed powerful figures within the royal network were urging calm, restraint, and silence rather than immediate exposure of the situation. But the more Catherine encountered polite delays and carefully worded reassurances, the more one chilling possibility formed in her mind that the system surrounding the crown might already be trying to manage the narrative before the truth had even fully emerged. And if that suspicion was correct, then the battle she was facing was no longer just about her son's health. It was about breaking through centuries of royal control to uncover what had been quietly unfolding behind the palace walls all along. The moment the first whispers escaped the palace walls, the entire situation transformed from a private crisis into a ticking public storm. And suddenly, the carefully controlled silence surrounding Catherine, Princess of Wales, began to feel less like protection and more like containment. Because by the time she started pushing harder for independent consultations, something inside the royal machine had already shifted into defensive mode. The corridors of the palace, once calm and ceremonial, became charged with quiet tension as advisors circulated behind closed doors, discussing not only the medical implications surrounding Prince Louis of Wales, but the far more dangerous possibility that the story could escape their control. Catherine could feel it in every conversation. Every response from palace officials carried the same carefully polished tone, measured, diplomatic, reassuring on the surface but hollow underneath. She asked for outside specialists. The answer was delay. She asked to review the full medical timeline. The answer was procedure. She asked the question no mother should ever have to ask inside her own family's institution: how long had concerns about her son existed before she was fully informed? And the room reportedly went quiet. Because behind the elegance and ritual of monarchy lies a brutal truth: the crown protects itself first. And Catherine was beginning to suspect that protecting the institution had quietly taken priority over protecting her child. Meanwhile, Prince William found himself caught in the most impossible position of his life. To the world, he remained composed, the future king trained from birth to absorb crisis without revealing the cracks. But behind closed doors, insiders say the strain was unmistakable. He was not only hearing frightening possibilities about his youngest son, he was also witnessing the slow collision between the woman he loved and the system he was destined to inherit. William encouraged patience, urging Catherine to trust the doctor selected by palace advisors, but even he reportedly sensed the growing unease around the situation because the timeline simply didn't add up. Small concerns had existed for months, maybe longer. Tests had been mentioned quietly. Observations had been documented. Yet the decisive moment, the conversation that shattered Catherine in that medical room, had arrived suddenly, as if someone had waited until the last possible moment to allow the truth to surface. And that delay became the most explosive question of all. Inside the palace, whispers began circulating about internal disagreements. Some advisors argued that revealing too much too soon could trigger unnecessary speculation about the royal family's stability. Others insisted that silence would only make things worse if the information leaked, and leaks inside royal institutions have a strange way of behaving. They rarely trickle out slowly. They explode. That explosion finally arrived through a channel no one had expected. According to insiders familiar with the situation, a carefully encrypted message from someone within the palace medical network reached journalists outside the royal bubble, carrying fragments of the very information that had been so tightly contained. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, media outlets and online commentators began dissecting every past appearance involving Louis. Clips resurfaced showing the young prince looking unusually tired during ceremonies. Photographs were analyzed frame by frame. What had once been harmless moments of childhood suddenly became pieces of a much darker puzzle. The palace communications office scrambled to regain control, issuing statements urging privacy and restraint, but the storm had already begun. And inside the palace, the effect was seismic, because once the story left the walls, the centuries-old tools used to protect royal secrecy, silence, hierarchy, loyalty no longer worked the way they once had. Public curiosity grew louder with every passing hour, and Catherine realized that the battle she had been fighting privately was now unfolding in full view of the world. Yet for her, the headlines were never the point. The noise outside only sharpened the urgency she had felt since that moment in the doctor's office. Her focus remained singular: clarity, truth, and the freedom to pursue every possible answer for her son. Each delay, each carefully worded statement from palace officials only reinforced her determination. Because once a mother's instinct is triggered, protocol becomes irrelevant. The monarchy had spent centuries mastering control, shaping narratives, smoothing crises before they reached the public eye. But this time, the crisis was deeply human, impossible to package neatly into a press release. And as Catherine continued pushing against the quiet resistance around her, the palace itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the unfolding reality. Staff moved cautiously through corridors where whispers replaced normal conversation. Advisors debated strategy behind closed doors. Even senior royals began to understand that the situation had moved beyond quiet management. The question was no longer whether the truth would emerge, it was how much of it could still be controlled. And in the center of that storm stood Catherine, no longer simply a royal figure bound by tradition, but a mother refusing to let centuries of protocol stand between her and the answers she needed. Because the most unsettling part of this entire saga remains the question that still echoes through those palace halls: if the signs had been there all along, if the concerns had quietly circulated among insiders for months, then why did the revelation arrive so suddenly, so late, and under such intense secrecy? The monarchy may still be trying to close ranks around that mystery, but the cracks are already visible. And as the public scrutiny intensifies and new details continue surfacing, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: this story has only just begun, and whatever comes next may shake the palace far more than anyone inside it expected.